China, the land of the dragon. To everyone who has ever seen an old-fashioned Chinese postage stamp, or a Chinese vase, or a piece of Chinese embroidery, the great, sprawling, grinning Chinese dragon is as familiar a figure as the American eagle or the British lion. And in China itself this fearsome beast is to be met with everywhere, on the roofs of houses, in the gardens of temples, on paper lanterns, porcelain teacups, and bells and gongs of bronze. If there be any truth in the description of the dragon written by a Chinese sage, it would be anything but a pleasant creature to come across, even if it were fast asleep. It has, he tells us, the head of a camel, the horns of a deer, the neck of a serpent, the scales of a carp, the paws of a tiger, on either side of its mouth are huge whiskers, and the curling vapor from its nostrils changes sometimes into rain and sometimes into fire. Its voice is like the beating of a gong. Before the year 1912, when China became a republic, the emperor used himself to be described as a dragon. His hands were called the dragon's claws, his throne the dragon's chair, and when a Chinese emperor died, his polite and regretful subjects said that he had ascended on a dragon to be the guest of heaven. Legends and fairy tales about these weird monsters are found all over the world, and not only in the Far East. Everyone will think at once of St. George, and then there was the dragon who guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides in the Greek story, and the dragon which the Norse pirates regarded as a mascot, and placed as a figurehead on the prows of their ships. Some learned people believe that these legends are lingering echoes of the far-off days when huge, lizard-like creatures really did exist in the plains of Central Asia. Saurians, they are called in scientific language, and many Chinese believe that they exist even now, though nobody is bold enough to declare that he himself has seen one. So numerous are the pictures and images of the beast in China and Japan that the children are no more afraid of them than they would be of the picture of a big dog. In the temple courts you will see little yellow-colored boys playing merrily under the bristling shadows of the sacred dragons, and even lying down to take a little nap between their huge, sharp paws. China, then, is the land of the dragon, a vast, ancient, and very wonderful land. In spite of the rapid changes which have marked the last 14 or 15 years, in spite of the spread of Western ideas and the introduction of Western machinery, it remains one of the most quaint and curious countries in the whole world, a country where, at every turn, a traveler from the West would see something to amuse or astonish him. For many hundreds of years the only way in which such a traveler could reach the mysterious empire of Cathay, as it was called, would be by sea. To the north and west of the country lie the fierce, perilous peaks of Tibet and the dreary deserts of Mongolia, regions that have only recently been explored by white men. But, after all, it is much more exciting to approach a strange country from the sea than in an UN romantic railway train by land, and there could be no more picturesque first impression of China than the vision of a Chinese harbor, with its low, flat houses roofed with glittering tiles and its waters dotted with queer-looking craft, chiefly junks and sampans. It has been said that there are more boats to be found in China than in all the rest of the world put together, and it is hardly surprising that this should be so, for it has not only a very long sea coast, but many great rivers, lakes, and artificial canals. The junk is the favorite type of boat for seagoing Chinamen, and an odd-looking one it is, with its flat bottom, high stern, square bows, and sails made of straw matting. The Chinese were the first nation to discover the use of the mariner's compass, and, with its aid, they made daring voyages on their awkward, unwieldy junks, in the glorious days of their history, faring as far afield as Java, India, Ceylon, the Gulf of Persia, and the coast of Arabia. Before he launches his boat for a voyage, a pious Chinese boatman will let off rockets, and, after sacrificing a chicken, stick up 3 slips of paper stained with its blood in front of the cabin. An outward-bound junk is a lovely sight, with her sails of golden-colored matting, of every shade from saffron to flame, but if she meet with rough weather, or if, as her master would say, the bob-tailed dragon is about, she may return in a sad plight, with her straw-woven wings tattered and stained. The sampan is a much lighter boat, usually propelled by a single oar at the stern, and able to dart to and fro with wonderful nimbleness among the bigger craft lying at anchor in deep water. The first thing that would impress you about a typical Chinese town might be either the lowness of the buildings or the narrowness of the streets. All the roofs are sharply peaked and pointed, and the reason for this is curious. The Chinaman is a firm believer in wicked spirits, but he also believes that even the most wicked and the most powerful of them cannot get round a corner. So he makes his roof full of corners, for the confusion and bafflement of any evil sprites that may happen to be hovering round. Another interesting thing about the Chinese roof is its resemblance to a tent. Many thousands of years ago the land was overrun by great hordes from the deserts to the north, or wild, wandering tribes who swept down upon the rich plains of China, settled there, and were the ancestors of the people who live there now. These tribes were what are called nomads. That is to say, they did not live in houses or villages, or settle in one spot, but moved about from place to place, dwelling in tents like the Jews of old and the Arabs in our own time. When, after they had taken possession of China, these Mongolians did begin to build, they seem to have been haunted by the remembrance of their movable homes, and so they gave to their houses the form of a tent, not a bell tent, like you see in Boy Scouts camps or at Army manservers, but the higher kind of tent, with a square, steeply slanting roof, which could shelter a whole family. Presently we will pay an imaginary visit to several different Chinese towns, and notice in what way they differ from each other. But first of all we may pause to notice some features common to almost all of them. Though very few really ancient temples or palaces remain in the land, there are many very ancient walls, walls built round cities, and walls built as a barrier against invasion. Most famous of these is the Great Wall of China, which measures, if you include all its windings, about 1,500 miles from end to end, and was begun in the 3rd century before Christ. It is from 20 to 30 feet high, and every 200 yards stands a 40-foot tower. At the base it is from 15 to 25 feet thick. This wonderful wall is carried through valleys and over mountains, like the much smaller and less wonderful Roman wall built by Hadrian to keep the Picts out of Roman Britain. In some places it climbs over lonely crags 4,000 feet above the sea level. They were enthusiastic wall builders, those Chinese of the olden times. The old name of the city of King was Ai, which means ought to be, and was given to the place because a famous Chinese general went there before it was built at all, and, halting, exclaimed aloud, "There ought to be a fortified city here." The narrowness of the streets in Chinese towns is made to appear greater than it actually is by the tremendous number of signs hanging outside the dark, mysterious-looking, queerly scented shops. These signs will be gaily painted, sometimes in black on scarlet, or gold on black, or scarlet on pale blue, and they will tell you, if you happen to be able to read them, what may be bought within. The crowd coming and going between these dangling strips of brilliant color will be a constant delight to a visitor from the West. Even now, when many Chinamen have taken to wearing European clothes, which, by the way, do not suit them at all, there are many picturesque varieties of costume to be seen. The poorer people wear blue cotton, and huge straw hats which serve to keep off the sun or the rain, as the case may be. In winter the richer citizens look enormously fat, and get fatter outwardly every day that the cold weather lasts. This is because instead of warming themselves with closed-in stoves or cozy open fires, they protect themselves against the frost with more and thicker padded garments. To these the very rich will add coats of beautiful dark sables, the most costly furs in the world. They will speak of a 3-4- or 6-coat cold day. Until quite recently you would not see any ladies or little girls in the streets, and those that you see now will not, as a rule, be wearing native dress. The very fact that they are seen means that they have exchanged Eastern for Western ideas, and no longer lead that life of strict seclusion which a well-to-do Chinaman once thought the best possible life for his wife and daughters to lead. There could be no more comfortable or dignified dress than the Chinese dress, which is now being gradually abandoned in the centers where European influence is strong. It consists of a long, loose outer jacket, and equally long and loose trousers, made in summer of silk, in winter of padded cotton. Violent contrasts of color are not admired, and purple and deep blue are favorite colors. The thick-soled boots are usually of black satin. At his girdle a Chinaman will carry his fan, opium pipe, snuff box, watch, and the chopsticks with which he so deftly supplies the place of knife and fork. Horn spectacles, with moonlight lenses, may give him a sage and learned air. And the nails on some of his fingers may have been allowed to reach a length of 2 inches or more. If he is a Mandarin he may wear a long necklace of beads, ivory, amber, or jade, and at one time a glance at the button on his turned-up round cap would tell you to which grade or rank of Mandarins he belonged. One characteristic item in the appearance of a Chinaman has vanished, regretted by no one, and that is the queue, or pig tail, which you will now see only on teacups, or embroideries, or painted fans and screens. When, in the 17th century, China was invaded and conquered by the Manchus, or Manchurians, the invaders issued an edict that every man and boy among their subjects should shave the whole of his head except a small spot on the crown, from which a long twist of hair was to be allowed to hang. This quaint custom did not disappear until the dawn of the present century. Chinamen had almost forgotten that it was really a badge of servitude, and had come to take such a pride in the length and thickness of their pigtails that if their own hair did not satisfy them they added a little more to it. If, in a Chinese street, you saw a sort of sedan chair called a palanquin, a gorgeous thing with lacquered panels, scarlet tassels and bamboo poles, being borne along by blue-clad coolies, you would guess that there was a Chinese lady inside, and, as a rule, you would not be wrong. The dress of a Chinese lady of high degree is not very different from that of her husband, and consists, like his, of long trousers and a loose jacket. According to Chinese ideas, it is most unladylike not to wear trousers. The jacket of a Mandarin's wife may be rather gayer than his, and embroidered with designs in beautifully blended colors, designs where our old friend the dragon is often to be found, stretching and twisting his scaly form on the fine, tough silk. At one time all Chinese women of the upper rank thought it necessary to paint their faces until they looked like stiff, bright masks. They would dabble their lips with scarlet, and if the curve of their eyebrows did not please them they would pull out the hairs and make new and more elegantly drawn brows with the aid of a stick of black paint. Another, and even more curious, custom which has only lately ceased to prevail, was the binding of the girls' feet until they were reduced from their natural size to pitiful deformed stumps not more than 3 or 4 inches long. Upon these stumps the unfortunate Chinese ladies had to totter about as best they could. It is hardly surprising to know that many of them gave up walking altogether, and preferred to sit still, or to be carried about in what English children call a dander chair, made of the clasped hands of 2 obliging people. The headdress of a Chinese lady is very elaborate, and on state occasions may be decked with jade butterflies, or a sorte wedding procession of mosaic made from the vivid blue feathers of the kingfisher mingled with small pearls. It must be remembered that all the customs here described are /z// faithfully followed in China by thousands of old-fashioned families, and that the past tense is used only to indicate that the observance of them is no longer universal, and is discouraged by the progressive and up-to-date younger generation. If the palanquin that you see passing along a Chinese street is entirely covered with scarlet, and if it is the center of a small procession of men bearing scarlet boxes, you may be sure that a bride is on her way to the house of the bridegroom, whom she has never seen. She is escorted by one of his friends, whose part is the same as that of the best man in a Western wedding, and the scarlet boxes contain her trousseau. The bridegroom will probably be very young, far too young, according to European ideas, to take upon himself the responsibilities of the head of a household. Only, in China, the newly married couple do not set up a house of their own, but quarters are set apart for them in the house of the bridegroom's father. the little bride has to be very obedient to her mother-in-law and, if she has one, her grandmother-in-law, and she must burn incense to the spirits of her husband's ancestors, bride and bridegroom, wearing special garments borrowed for the occasion now as if they were her own. Ancestor worship is the strongest element in the native religion of China, and a man is looked upon as a terrible fellow, an outcast from society, who is lacking in pious respect for his forebears, both the living and the dead. There is no country in the world where it is more important for a boy to behave well, for if he does ill, his ancestors share in the credit, while if he is a naughty boy, or grows up into a bad character, all his ancestors are besmirched by his guilt. Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher, declared that every virtue had its source in politeness. Perhaps he was not very far wrong, for it is certainly impolite to rob and slay, and to bear false witness against your neighbor. The trembling girl bride has at least the consolation of knowing beforehand that her husband will be courteous and well-bred, and carefully schooled in all those little social graces which the Chinese consider so important. The cult of ancestor worship makes every Chinaman who follows it feel very anxious to have a son of his own, but, fortunately for the peace of mind of pious people who have none, an adopted child is regarded as quite equal to the task of worshipping the ancestors of the family into which he has been received. According to the religion of the ancient Chinese, Taoism, each man has 3 souls, of which one is supposed to be fixed and held in the votive tablet, commemorating his virtues, which his eldest son sets up after his death. His children wear white garments as a sign of mourning for at least 2 years, burn incense to his shade, and, at his funeral, are careful to provide him with paper models of everything which he may require on his journey to the land of spirits. These paper objects, money, carriages, men, and maidservants, etc., are solemnly burned over the dead man's grave, where a white cock, supposed to contain the second of his 3 souls, is either slain at the graveside, or made to bow there 3 times by each member of the bereaved family. Sons play such an important part in the ceremonies considered necessary to ensure happiness in the next world that, naturally, the birth of a baby boy is hailed with greater enthusiasm than that of his sisters, but it is a mistake, and one which annoys enlightened Chinamen very much, to imagine that thousands of baby girls are drowned every year, or left to die of exposure outside the city wall. It is only among the very, very poor that this gruesome custom has ever been practiced, but in times of famine it does seem to have been practiced rather extensively in some districts, notably in Fuchao, where a stone was set up near a pool, bearing the inscription "Girls may not be drowned here." When a tiny Chinaman of the well-to-do class is born, his first garments are not specially made to fit him, as are those of babies in Western lands, but consist of heavy wrappings fashioned out of the coat and trousers of some aged man at least 70 years old. It is believed that in some mysterious way the wearing of such clothes will ensure an equally long life to the newborn child. When he is a month old his head is shaved, and a feast is held in honor of the occasion. Soon his nurse begins to teach him nursery rhymes and baby games. She shows him how to join his forefingers to make 2 little birds kissing, then, as he slowly separates his hands and raises and spreads out his arms, she says, "And now the birds have gone to the high hills to eat white rice." A nursery rhyme sung to babies in the Kweichow district runs like this: "Sleep is drawing near, it tells me to doff my embroidered shoes. Asterisk lie down, says the matting on the bed, asterisk cover yourself up, says the quilt, asterisk asterisk sleep well, sleep quickly, adds the pillow. I will. And I shall have some sweets tomorrow." From his earliest years our little Chinese boy is taught to be very respectful to his elders, very quiet in his movements, and very silent under all circumstances. Noisy games are forbidden, but sometimes an indulgent father will go out and fly a huge gaily colored paper kite with his sons, and enjoy the sport every whit as much as they. If the boy is punished he must never protest or answer back. If he is punished for something he has not done, he may not try to explain or to excuse himself. Among themselves the Chinese do not shake hands or kiss each other, but they kowtow, or bow very low, and clasp and shake their own hands with great heartiness. They adorn their ordinary speech with all sorts of pretty phrases. A Chinaman, in alluding to a friend's daughter, for example, will not say your daughter, but your kai-en chin, your 10,000 ounces of silver. In asking after his friend's father he will say, does the venerable severity enjoy good health, and should he desire to learn in what town a stranger lives, he puts the question in this way, in what favoured spot do you, in your wisdom, deign to dwell? The first and most important part of the small boy's education consists in learning to keep his temper, to repress himself, and to offend against none of the many rules of etiquette by which his whole life is to be governed. At 6 years of age he goes to school, asks the aid of the fox god to speed him along the road of learning, and, after kowtowing to the image of Confucius, begins the labours of the day. Simple proverbs and short sentences are set to him, to learn by heart. Some of these proverbs are quite amusing. For example, a good drum does not need a heavy stick. A blind cat catches none but dead mice. It is useless to return a salted fish to the water. A lazy man uses a long thread, a foolish one, a bent needle. The old-fashioned Chinese education consisted almost entirely of the close and prolonged study of the Chinese classics, poetry, philosophy, and the lives of bygone worthies. Grammar had no part in it, for Chinese is a non-grammatical language. The art of writing is alarmingly difficult, for it is done with fine brushes upon rice paper, in long columns of elaborate characters, beginning from the right top of the page, and running downward from right to left. This means, of course, that in a Chinese book you would find the words the end, where in a Western book you would see a chapter 1. We all know what Chinese writing looks like, how queer the angular, jagged, and peaked letters seem to our unaccustomed eyes. We can well understand how it happened that the people who had such a complicated alphabet were the first to discover the art of printing, which they practiced with considerable skill long before Gutenberg and Caxton introduced it into Europe. The Chinese characters represent sounds and ideas, but not words composed of letters. The principle is what is called pictographic, or writing in pictures. Thus, the sign for a tree repeated twice means a forest, the sign for the sun and that for the moon written together mean a brightness, a man and a woman together signify goodness, or a happiness, two women under one roof, strife. Europeans are often surprised and a little hurt when they are told that the Chinese regard them as barbarians. We are apt to forget that China was a highly civilized nation, with a magnificent literary culture, at a time when Europe was a rude, perplexed, and stormy continent, plunged in the deepest gloom of the Dark Ages. The Chinese are quite conscious of this fact. Their own name for their country is Chunghwa, Central Glory. And their childish imagination is fed with visions of the old-time splendors of Chunghwa. The rules governing Chinese poetry are elaborate and severe, and are said to have been handed down unaltered for 2,500 years. An educated Chinaman must be familiar with these rules, and able to compose verses in accordance with them, the composition of such verses being the chief task set before students who come up for examination, and who aspire to enter government service. Here, again, it must be borne in mind that the last few years have witnessed great changes, but all grown men still living among the higher classes in China must have been educated on the lines here described, unless they belong to some non-Chinese religious sect. The centuries which were darkest in Europe seem to have been brightest in China, for many of their most renowned poets flourished in the 7th, 8th, and 11th centuries of the Christian era. One of these, Meng Haojian by name, AD 689 to 740, was such a timid fellow that when the emperor came in person to pay him a complimentary visit he hastily hid himself under the bed. Wang Wei, a friend of his, was, like many Chinese poets, a skillful landscape artist as well. When Wang Wei's wife and mother died he was so heartbroken that he turned his mountain home into a Buddhist monastery, and spent the remainder of his days in lonely meditation. the best known, and one of the most popular of the poets whose works the Chinese boy had to learn by heart, was Li Po, AD 705 to 770. He lived at Chengdu, in a district where beautiful trees and flowers abound, the mulberry and the eucalyptus, the peony, the hibiscus, the night-closing violet, and many varieties of rose. In his youth he and 5 kindred spirits formed a small literary club, called the 6 Idlers of the Bamboo Brook, but his later life seems to have been stormy and restless, and he exclaims in one of his poems, "How oft in danger and despair do hapless travelers roam, by land and sea alike unsafe. Why don't I stay at home?" One poor Li Po was drowned one night, leaning over the side of a boat in a vain attempt to embrace the reflection of the moon on the water. Another very brilliant poet of nearly 1,000 years ago was Su Tianpo. He excelled at the kind of short lyric in which the aim of the poet is to make the zdia go on, after the words come to a halt. These poems are known as stop shorts, and they are still popular among the cultured Chinese, who find it very good sport to compose them. Such, then, were the poets and the poems which the Chinese boy had to study in school. Whatever religion he belonged to, he was bound to begin each day's work by kowtowing to the image of Confucius, the wise and benign teacher who lived in the 6th century BC and set so much store by politeness. The 2 faiths which would be most likely to claim him would be either Taoism or Buddhism. Taoism is an elaborate religion, full of ghosts and demons, enchantments and fairy beasts. The word Tao means the way, and the man whom the Chinese believe to have pointed out this one true way lived, like Confucius, in the 6th century before Christ, and was called Lao Tzu. Not very much is known about his career, but if there be any truth in the legends which gathered round his name, he must have been a queer-looking fellow. We are told that he had unusually large ears, 2 bridges to his nose, and 10 toes on each foot. His contemporary, Confucius, founded a system of conduct rather than a religion, so it must be remembered that the boy who kowtows to an image of the sage may be a good Taoist or a good Buddhist nonetheless. The religion of Buddha, about which we shall hear more when we find ourselves in the land where its founder lived, India, reached China some 200 years before Christ. One legend says that the emperor of that time had a dream in which he beheld a golden man, and sent messengers far and wide to find the meaning of the vision, and that at last the answer came from India that the golden man was none other than Buddha himself. Another legend relates that certain Buddhist monks arrived in Chunhua on a missionary journey, and were cast into prison by the indignant followers a schoolmaster and his pupil of the many-toed Lao Tzu, and that they were delivered from their captivity by the golden man, Buddha, whose religion they had come to teach. Whatever the historical facts may be about the first coming of Buddhism to China, it is certain that by the 4th century of the Christian era the whole land of the dragon had been reached by the new religion, which to this day shares with Taoism the chief place in the affections of the people. It is curious, and perhaps a little sad, that China and not India should be the greatest Buddhistic country in the world, and that the faith of the gentle Buddha should have been gradually thrust out of the place where he lived and taught and died, to survive mainly in other lands, such as China, Japan, Siam, Java, and the Malay states, which he had never beheld. In China, Buddhism has borrowed so many ceremonies from Taoism that it is said to be rather difficult for strangers to distinguish between the temples and temple services of the 2 religions, which flourish peacefully side by side. Our little Chinese boy, whom we left kowtowing before Confucius, is then, most probably, a follower either of Buddha or of Lao Tzu. If, as is not impossible, he is a Christian, he will refuse to bow his head to any image. There are many Christians among the Chinese, and there have been many Christian missionaries since the far-off days when a little band of Nestorians came from Persia and founded a Christian community which prospered so well that it seemed for a time as if Christianity might become the national religion. When Marco Polo, the great Phoenician explorer, visited China in the 13th century, he found the last shrinking remnants of this Christian sect still faithful after a lapse of more than 500 years. It was in the 16th century that the two earliest Jesuit missionaries, Father Ruggiero and Father Ricci, were sent to China by the Pope. At the beginning of the 20th century, there are said to have been over 1 million Chinese Roman Catholics. The first Protestant missionary was Dr. Robert Morrison, who arrived at the scene of his labors in 1807, and who tackled and completed the gigantic task of translating the entire Bible into Chinese. Since that time, Protestant missions have multiplied, and Protestant colleges, hospitals, and orphanages have sprung up all over the land of the Dragon. In these good works a foremost part has been played by the American missionaries, one of whom, Dr. Guile, followed the Great Wall of China from end to end, a pilgrimage of 1,500 miles, early in the present century, and also visited and described every single one of the 18 capitals of the Chinese Empire. In addition to Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity, there is one other great religion to which our Chinese schoolboy might perhaps belong, and that is Mohammedanism. In 755 the Caliph Abu Ja'far sent 4,000 Mohammedan soldiers to suppress a rebellion in China, and the descendants of these men and their converts still hold fast to the faith of him whom they call the Prophet, and are allowed by the Chinese government to build mosques and worship Allah, God, in their own way. Our Chinese schoolboy, studying the classical poets of old Cathay in a Chinese school, has no cricket or football to look forward to when lesson hours are done. The most exciting games he may hope to play are kite flying, battledore and shuttlecock, and dominoes. Green plums and peanuts are the treats which he gives himself and his playfellows. On his homeward way he may linger on the edge of a little crowd gathered round a shadow theatre. The puppets are worked by one man, in the same way as our old friends, Punch and Judy, and the theatre is simply a wooden framework placed over the head and shoulders of the showman, who is draped to his ankles with a sort of curtain of blue cotton. When the schoolboy reaches his home, the rambling, one-storied house where so many members of the same family live, he will not find what Western children would consider a cozy room or a tempting dinner there. But his ideas are different from theirs, and he sees nothing cheerless in the stiff, hard chairs, the rigid, flat beds, raised only about a foot from the floor, which are the chief furniture of the house, and nothing unpleasant in the queer dainties, smoked rats, sea slug soup, shark's fins, pickled fir cones, rotten eggs and bird's nest soup, this last made from the edible clay homes of a family of Asiatic swifts, which will be served with the rice, which is the most important item in every Chinese meal. So universal is the use of rice that one Chinaman will often greet another with the words, "Have you eaten your rice?" much as we should say, "How are you this morning?" Rice is cultivated in flat, marshy districts, and several varieties are known, some as low as 1 foot and some as lofty as 6 feet high. When ripe it may be white, golden, ruddy, or black. The soil in which it grows must be either naturally muddy or else kept so by artificial means, such as canals and water wheels. The result is that the men and oxen working in the paddy fields, paddy is rice in the husk, usually have to plod along knee-deep in ooze and mud. This is one of the most familiar sights of Chinese country life. It looks most uncomfortable, yet, oddly enough, the cultivators do not catch cold. Sneezes are seldom heard, and rheumatism is practically unknown. All over China ideas about agriculture are very simple, and sometimes very quaint. Only the surface of the fields is ploughed, and to improve the crops burnt out rockets, feathers, and clippings from barbers' shops are scattered in the furrows. Rice, then, is to our little Chinese boy what bread would be to a Westerner, the chief part of his diet. He also knows and appreciates the taste of roast chicken, roast pork, and roast duck. Of ducks the Chinese are especially fond, and on many rivers and lakes you may see what are called duck boats. The owner of such a boat keeps a large family of ducks on board, and once or twice a day he throws a plank ashore, and the birds march along it, single file, to their feeding grounds. It is one of the most amusing sights in the world to see these solemn processions of ducks, moving as regularly as a well-drilled army, going forth to feed or returning across the narrow plank to their floating homes. The chief drink of the Chinese of all classes is tea, and in no country does that delightful plant possess a more delicate flavor. We barbarians add milk and sugar to ours, but in China these additions are considered unnecessary, and a faint hint of flower essence, such as orange flower, jessamine, rose, or azalea, is thought much more elegant. The house in which our Chinese boy lives may not seem very cozy or homelike in our eyes, but it is almost sure to contain some marvels of native art. The stiff-looking chairs are exquisitely carved out of hard, glossy blackwood. The solemn cabinets are lacquered with the intense red varnish obtained from a tree called the Rus vernicifera. On these cabinets will stand vases and images of milky white jade, or many-colored porcelain, dusky bronze, or ivory yellow with years. We all know that our English word china, applied to porcelain, is a reminder of the country where the art of the potter was first developed to the highest perfection, but I do not think so many of us are aware that the word silk has the same origin. In the language of the ancient Greeks, dijpes, meant the Chinese people, the inhabitants of that vast, remote, and mysterious Asiatic empire of which the Greek mariners and traders were vaguely aware. Now the first and most famous commodity which the ancient world obtained from that empire was silk, which, in the language of the Chinese themselves, was, and is, called zi. When one knows this, it is clear why the Greeks should have dubbed the silk-making nation the Circe, the Zres. And from that Greek word come all these European equivalents, the English silk, the French soie, the German seder, the Spanish seda, the Italian seta. According to tradition, the art of weaving into a beautiful fabric the delicate floss spun by the silkworms was introduced into China by Selingshi, the wife of the Emperor Xinneng, 2737 to 2697 BC. This inventive lady has been canonized, that is to say, solemnly recognized and honored as a saint, and sticks of incense are still burned before her joss, or image, on a certain day in the 9th month of the year. When China was still an empire, the Empress and her ladies used to worship at the shrine of Selingshi on that day, and go through the ceremony of collecting the mulberry leaves, feeding the palace silkworms, and winding off some cocoons of silk. When we are proud, and, perhaps, rightly proud, of Western progress, we ought not to forget that the hands of men have never created anything more beautiful than the porcelains and the silks of which the Chinese discovered the secret so many hundreds of years ago. Though a Chinese house might seem to our eyes more quaint and severe than charming, we could none of us fail to be fascinated by the typical Chinese garden. Many of us who have never visited the land of the dragon have an idea of what that garden would be like, an idea which we take from the familiar scene on a willow pattern plate. Little bridges, little summer houses with peaked roofs, weeping willows, and feathery fir trees, all these things we have seen in blue and white porcelain and would see in their natural colors if we went to the country where that porcelain was first made. 111 years before Christ was born, the Emperor Wu Ti established a botanic garden and encouraged the study of plants and flowers. Chinese gardeners have a great advantage in living and working in a country where beautiful flowers abound, and where there are more than 4,000 species of flowering plants unknown elsewhere. The peach, the orange, and the wisteria are natives of China, as are also many exquisite varieties of the camellia, rose, lily, rhododendron, and peony. For the rose, Chinese artists seem to have an especial love, and you will find a very large one of a wide-open, shaggy-petal type on many cups and saucers, and in panels of fine needlework. Bridges and arches, often roofed with brilliantly colored tiles, are a very familiar feature of a Chinese landscape. The great paved causeway from Kucha to Quyang is spanned by 29 of these arches, erected at various times to commemorate the remarkable virtues of some inhabitant of the district. One of these was built in memory of a beautiful and wealthy widow who steadfastly refused to take a second husband. Another bears the name of a farmer who refused to put up the price of rice in a time of famine. Let us suppose that our Chinese boy has finished his schooling, has mastered the contents of the 4,320 volumes of the Chinese Encyclopedia, and is preparing himself for his career as a government official. It may now be necessary for him to make a long journey, though without leaving his native land. The broad, yellow-colored river Yangtze, usually called the Yangtze for short, in its course of 2,900 miles washes the walls of 7 of the 18 ancient capitals of China, and our Chinese youth will probably prefer to travel by water, as roads are bad, good horses scarce, and in the caves of the mountains robbers abound. It may occasionally happen nowadays that certain robbers are seized by the governor of a province, enrolled in the army, and sent off, each with his fan and his paper umbrella, to fight in some other district where fighting is in progress. But our young friend's family will not wish him to run any needless risks, and, after burning incense to all the ancestors and all the friendly spirits, he will set off on a journey from Hangzhou to Tainan, going by water for the best part of the way. If, in spite of all the trouble taken to obtain the goodwill of the unseen powers, he should fall ill during his travels, one hopes he may be near a mission hospital, and not fall into the hands of a native doctor, who would endeavor to cure a tummy ache by sticking needles into the seat of the pain, or a headache by large doses of snakeskin or powdered oyster shells. Arriving at the walled city of Hangzhou, the traveler will pause in admiration before the chief gate, with its peaked roof covered with gaily glazed tiles, and its lofty walls, from the cracks in which spring nodding tufts of wild flowers. But if he pauses too long, or arrives too late in the day, the gates of the city may be closed against him. And what will he do then, poor thing? Remain outside all night? Nothing quite so desperate as that. For the payment of 1 penny he can be hauled up in a basket, attached to a windlass, and in that way he can soon enter Hangzhou, unless, as occasionally happens, the porter in charge of the windlass is sleepy, or has had too much rice whiskey, when he is apt to leave the luckless occupant of the basket dangling for some time in mid-air. Once safely within, the traveler will understand why this place of many canals should be called Hangzhou, whichever of the two meanings attributed to the phrase be the right one. It means either to boat region or the city of the sail, and either name would be equally suitable. These canals are thickly dotted with boats and barges, and they teem with fish. They are spanned by many beautiful stone bridges, under some of which, known as dumb bridges, it is unlucky to speak as you pass. Through the center of the city runs a great street. Marco Polo saw it when he came here in the 13th century, but it has lost much of its splendor since then. Some of the inscriptions on the dangling signboards are very quaint. In the drug hall of propitious magnificence you can buy the Great Blessing Pill, a general tonic, or, what sounds more useful, the pill of 10,000 efficacies, which is guaranteed to cure 10,000 different diseases. So jealously guarded are the prescriptions for these marvelous pills that the ingredients are given to blind men to be mixed and pounded and rolled into balls. At Fuzhou the traveler will admire the White Pagoda, whose 7 stories were built in the 9th century, and rise to a height of 261 feet. There is a rather sad legend connected with one of the great mountains that loom beyond the city. A Chinese lady built a beautiful tower on the summit to welcome her husband on his return from a long voyage. But he did not know that she had done this, so when he sighted the tower from his ship he thought he must be steering into the wrong estuary, turned round, sailed away, and never came back any more. On reaching Canton our traveler will be told the legend of the 5 immortal beings who came to the city 2,000 years ago, riding upon goats. Their mounts were changed into stone and can be seen to this day, but what happened to the riders is less certain. The climate of Canton is dull and cloudy, but the streets are brilliant with color and the roofs bristle with dragons and devils, set there to frighten evil spirits away. On the Pearl River lies an unbelievably large and closely packed mass of native boats, in which whole families of fishermen and boatmen and their wives and children have their homes. Toward sunset the fumes which rise from their cooking pots make quite a thick haze above the river. Still traveling by water, our Chinese youth may now betake himself to Kuailin, a place frequented by 2 very different sorts of people, pirates and poets. Dense forests of cinnamon trees once clothed the fantastic Sugarloaf peaks, which surround the city and are reflected in the crystal-clear waters of the lakes. The trees have nearly all vanished, but there are caves among the hills where robbers lurk, ready to swoop down and assail travelers, or to launch boats in pursuit of richly laden craft. On the lakes you will see men fishing with the aid of tame cormorants. At night, fireworks and torches are used to dazzle the fish, and the black waters are dotted with sudden points of colored flame. One of the numerous poets who dwell in Kuala Lin, Lishi by name, was captured and held to ransom by these cave robbers, but he charmed their ears and softened their hearts so much with the following impromptu verses that they let him go unscathed. Over the streamside village the rainy vapors sweep, from the shadows of the forest the bandits' poignards leap. Yet why should we be anxious, or try to run away? The world is full of people far wickeder than they. To reach Kueyang, his next halting place, the traveler will have to cross a range of grim and lonely limestone mountains. The only inhabitants of the region are a peculiar tribe called the Miao. Their women wear short, kilted dresses, leaving the knees bare, peaked sunbonnets and necklaces of silver. In the spring all these women array themselves in gaily hued garments hung with tiny bells, and dance round a young fir tree to the music of bamboo pipes played by the men of the tribe. If our traveler desires to purchase some of the most beautiful silks that even this land of exquisite fabrics can offer, he will not omit a visit to Suzhou. In this quaint town, which is built, like Venice, among canals and lagoons, hundreds of busy weavers ply their trade. The looms, which have not changed their form for many centuries, stand on the earthen floors of the low, grimy huts. Beside each is a bowl of water, in which the weaver dips his hands from time to time. If the busy fellow takes a holiday and goes for a walk, he will have no less than 6 fine pagodas to look at, to say nothing of the clock tower which surmounts the university built by the Methodists of New Orleans. About 1,000 years ago there was a worthy citizen of Suzhou who was very anxious that the young men of his native city should always be good scholars. So, to inspire them with learned zeal, he built 2 pagodas in the form of pens, and one in the form of an ink pot. The ink that fills a Chinese pot is usually the so-called India * ink, really manufactured in a town which bears the cheerful name of Peace and Happiness, and King. The method of manufacture is curious. A large number of lamps is placed in a room with a low, knobby ceiling, and made to smoke, then the soot from the knobs is collected, and there is your India ink. Outside the eastern gate of Inking is a 7-story pagoda, all hung with tinkling bells, to which many pilgrims come. If our traveler pauses to scan the inscriptions which they have left behind them, he will find this amusing one, signed, a man from the Tungling Lake. On all sides are inscriptions, all written by fools. I, who am also a fool, add my scribble to theirs. I am clay of the same lump as themselves. About 100 years ago one of the most popular materials in England and America for gentlemen's trousers, and little boys' jackets, and old ladies' petticoats, was a stuff called nankeen, which took its name from the town of Nanjing where it was made. Those were the days of Nanjing's glory, when the porcelain pagoda, one of the marvels of Changhua, still towered above the tiled roofs, and the people were busily occupied making the fabric for the trousers of such famous Westerners as the Duke of Wellington and Lord Palmerston. But the porcelain pagoda was overthrown in the Lieping Rebellion, 1853. Nanking went out of fashion in the West, and now chestnuts and cherry trees shower their delicate petals upon the deserted gardens of palaces and temples where mandarins and monks dwell no more. But Zainan, where Confucius lived and taught, is still a center of great literary activity. In the course of his wanderings our Chinese friend will have seen much to make him more proud than ever of his own country, the Celestial Kingdom, as its children sometimes call it, and much, if he is a thoughtful boy, to make him anxious about the future. Since 1912, when the ancient empire was cast down and a republic set up in its stead, it has been difficult to tell in what direction China is moving, and what the fate of her millions of people will be. Peking, the gate of heaven, was the center of the empire and the chief home of the emperor, and to Peking our traveller is sure to go, if he has not been there before, or to return, if it is already familiar ground. Though it was not at Peking, but at the now ruined city of Xanadu, that Kubla Khan did a stately pleasure-dome decree, the hero of Coleridge's haunting little poem was the founder of the imperial splendor of the Chinese capital. Kubla Khan was not a Chinaman, but a Mongol, and a very powerful fellow indeed. His conquests made him ruler of a vast empire, stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Strait of Malacca, and from Korea to Asia Minor, and the confines of Hungary. He held his court in barbaric splendor at a city in northeastern China, then known as Cambaluc, but afterward as Peking. There he and his successors built a marvelous labyrinth of temples and palaces and gardens, walls within walls and gates within gates, the famous mysterious Forbidden City. The stately ceremonies, the stiff and gorgeous pageants, that once marked the daily life of the Son of Heaven, are no longer observed within those dragon-guarded courts. But even though the glory has departed, it must still be a thrilling experience to leave the bustle and clamor of the Tiananmen Street, where camels and donkeys and thick-necked, tawny Manchurian ponies, palanquins and rickshaws, light, two-wheeled carts for carrying passengers, drawn by coolies, all struggle together, and step through the square, yellow-tiled archway into the silence of those vast imperial domains. Stags and storks wrought in bronze guard the outer courtyard, where there are white marble lanterns, and golden bowls full of goldfish. Marvelous bridges of milk-white stone lead to the islands of the Lotus Lake. This is the palace known as the Winter Palace. The summer one is almost more gorgeous, with its glittering gateway of scarlet and green and gold, its crystal-clear lakes, its pagodas that look like the dwellings of quaint, more than mortal beings. Of the many temples in the ancient capital of Kubla Khan, none is more amazingly beautiful than the Temple of Heaven, believed by the Chinese to be the very center of the whole universe, where the emperor went in solemn procession every year, offered a sacrifice on the open-air altar, and adored the supreme creator of the universe. Only he, his people said, was worthy to offer that sacrifice and that adoration. Before approaching the altar, he was solemnly robed, in a special pavilion roofed with magnificent tiles of an intense peacock blue. There he donned his vestments embroidered with dragons in threads of pure gold, his ermine cap surmounted by 9 little golden dragons clasping one immense pearl, and his necklace of 108 pearls, and thence he was borne, under arches of purest marble and dazzling blue and green tiles, amid sounds of music, to the marble altar where he bowed himself in worship of the Shang-Ti, or supreme ruler, before whom even the emperor of the central glory of the world knew himself to be less than a grain of sand. From these deserted gardens and forgotten shrines our young Chinaman may return with a rather heavy heart to the city outside the girdling walls. There, instead of shining pagodas, gay with lovely colors and tinkling bells, he will see the stark and grimy chimneys of modern factory buildings. And, after dusk, instead of the soft, wavering gleam of painted paper lanterns, the pitiless blue glare of electric arc lamps will throw the shadows of the dragon-crested roofs upon the ground. Yet Peking is still a city of wonder, Kubla Khan's city, and the city of those delightful little dogs to whom we have given its name, but who were called sleeve dogs by the grave and gorgeous mandarins who used to carry one in either silken sleeve. Of all its wonders, which will dwell most clearly in the mind of the young traveller whom we have followed all the way from Hangzhou? If he should be the sort of youth who can only see what is before his nose, it may be the Temple of Heaven or the Lotus Lake. But if he be lucky enough to have a touch of poetic fancy, it will surely be the ancient observatory of Kubla Khan. Thence the wisest of the great Khan's servants watched and measured the movements of the stars. No one in the West had thought of such scientific experiments then, and the queerest and quaintest ideas prevailed about the order and meaning of the high hosts of the sky. To aid them in their task, the astronomers of the Khan had huge mathematical instruments, wrought of bronze. Our Chinese friend stood beside them, and saw that they are supported by great bronze dragons, imperial dragons, bristling and fierce, the emblems of a China that has had its day of splendor, and is now passing into the dim region of the things that have been, but can be no more.